All right, back again, solo episode, talking today about muscles in technique. And what I mean by this is like the separation of talking about pecs and triceps and deltoids and quads and hamstrings and glutes versus talking about the squat or the bench press or the deadlift. And this is a really important conversation because, in my opinion, this has probably created the most confusion in discussions around technique from when I started in lifting, and probably even worse so now, as more like, let's call it science-based lifting, anatomical discussions around training has become more popular. It gets really, really confusing. I want to start with one thing that Jordan Shallow actually imparted on me. So obviously Jordan Shallow he came up through powerlifting. He was doing his Cairo stuff. I can't tell his story, but like his popularity arc, he came up through Boss Barbell Club, Dan Green, all that stuff. Back in like 2016, 17, 18, he started getting bigger. He came out here. We touched base. I went to one of his workshops, and then I went over there and did some mentoring with him in person. Now, one thing he's always spoken about is this idea of muscle function versus muscle action. And back then, it really stuck in my head. It was this whole idea of like, this is what your bicep does. This is how it acts upon the joint, and therefore this is how you train the bicep, versus this is its function in terms of stabilizing the elbow, stabilizing the shoulder when you're doing a bench press. And that kind of blew my mind at the time because the whole concept of stability was a big discussion back then. The whole topic of stability was a big discussion. I should probably do one of these on stability eventually just to demystify that. And it was really helpful in categorizing, okay, what of these little exercises is actually helpful and going to translate into making an impact when we're doing squat, bench, deadlift versus what's just a waste of time. And it's still a really important discussion. This has actually formed the basis for me along the way of refining my technical understanding. Now, granted, Dr. Jordan and myself probably taking different paths, and there's a reason for that. And the big reason, and probably the biggest issue in our industry when we're talking about powerlifting and technique as a whole, is that there's no manual for this stuff. There is no defined gold standard. So a lot of ideas stem from somebody's picture of a gold standard in their head. And if that's different to somebody else, you're having a different conversation. And so what's important for one group or one educator or one big coach is going to be different based on their understanding of what a squat, bench press, or deadlift is, how it breaks down, how it works. So that whole idea of muscle action versus muscle function has really permeated and defined my way of thinking when it comes to technique. Here's the big problem, or here is a big problem when we start thinking about muscles in lifts. When we start talking about, okay, the adductors do this in the sumo versus the conventional or the squat. The pecs do this in a bench press. The triceps are responsible for lockout, all of that kind of stuff. You don't actually know. You're making a best guess as to what is doing what at any given point in time. What's safe to say is your quads are working really hard in the squat, and so are your glutes. Your pecs are working really hard in a bench press, and so are your triceps. It's safe to say that these things are doing work in these movements, but how much they're doing and at what point, you can't necessarily categorically say completely. And there's the added issue of reverse engineering it. Powerlifting technique as a whole, by the industry standard, is like IBS. Now stay with me. When I say IBS, I mean irritable bowel syndrome. I'm not talking about another IBS. I actually mean irritable bowel syndrome. It's very much like that. So what I mean by that is it is by and large, a description of the problem rather than the solution. But the problem is you describe the problem and you make it the solution, or you define the solution as the problem. Let me talk in English. So IBS is a description of symptoms. You got the, stomach discomfort, diarrhea. You don't want to lean into the diarrhea. It's not like you get told you have IBS and your problems go away. You're like, oh, I've got IBS. That's cool. Let me have more diarrhea. That's great. That's what we do in lifting. Think about it. Oh, no, I need to do more of this exercise because I am quad dominant. Oh, no, I need to train more triceps because I have a closed grip and I'm tricep dominant in my bench press. No, you're not. You've just found the best solution for you at this point in time. And so where this conversation has to start is that you have to understand positions. You have to understand what positions that you're trying to get into, that you're trying to maintain, that you're trying to strengthen. Powerlifting technique is all about positions, not muscles. Do your muscles work in positions? Yes. Will how your muscles work change in certain positions? Potentially, yes. But again, you don't know. You just know that they do. And then you're talking about branching into two different things, training muscles versus training movements. And in powerlifting, primarily our focus should be on training movements. In order to be able to do that, you have to have a really in-depth, defined understanding of what the movement is, of what the positions you're trying to get into are. This is super important because it's going to stop you from writing programs and following programs that completely waste your time, or at least do not make the best use of your time. In order to reverse engineer technique and what the solutions are going to be for your technique, you have to understand where you want to go with your technique. Now, if you don't want to change your technique at all, that's fine. Then you can focus on whatever you want. But if you want to be the best powerlifter possible, guarantee right now there are bottlenecks in your technique that need to be fixed in order for you to express more strength. And as a powerlifter, your number one goal should be to express more strength. In order to do that, you need to refine your technique, perfect your technique in what is going to be the best way of moving weight in the long term. This is the really challenging thing with coaching, with lifting, with technique, is that it's not about what can you do now. It's about what do you need to change about what you do now to ensure that you do better in the future. And the only way you can know what that is going to be is if you've seen it happen before. And if you've seen it happen before over and over again in the same way, you can be sure that you're moving someone in the right direction. That's confidence in coaching. In order to do that, you have to have a gold standard in your head. It doesn't have to be my gold standard, but you have to believe that you're moving towards a particular technique for this individual or overall in order to make those changes, in order to believe in those changes, and in order to integrate that into the programming to make sure that the person is moving towards getting stronger under the bar. You have to have a really in-depth understanding. So I challenge you, go away. If you're making corrections with the technique and if you're writing programs to help overcome these problems, think about it deeply. Think about it obviously. Don't think outside of the box. Be as obvious as you possibly can. Example, someone's got a horrifically rounded back when they squat and you're trying to get it straighter, right? You don't have to think, okay, well, in order to extend their spine, they need to do spinal extensions. They need to round and then extend on, say, a hyperextension. That's not the movement that you're trying to correct. The movement that you're trying to correct is to get their spine straight and hold it rigid while they're going forward and back as they would in a squat. That's what you need to then train. Your first question then is, can they stand with their spine straight? If they have the empty bar on their back, can they stand upright with their spine straight, rigid, locked in the way that you'd expect to see it while they're moving through a squat? If the answer is yes, you've got something to work with, then you can start to scale. You can start to be like, okay, empty bar, let's do a good morning, let's do an RDL, let's hold that position, let's now start to load it, find the breaking point, and then train underneath that and slowly increase it and make it better in the squat, as well as cueing it better in the squat. It needs to be as simple and as logical as that. And in order to do it that simply and logical, you need to have a complex understanding of the movement. You can only simplify something, you can only educate and articulate something complex if you have a complex understanding of it. And the more complex your understanding is, the simpler you can make it. And what you'll find with squat, bench press, deadlift, these are very simple movements when you break it down. So you need to have an understanding of technique. You need to have an understanding of positions. Once you have an understanding of positions, you need to logically strengthen those positions. Another common example is probably the most common example in terms of trying to refine and get better at technique is going to be the sumo deadlift. I hesitate to say it's more technical than the conventional deadlift because it's still relatively simple. It requires more stabilization, which requires more thought. So it's not that it's more complex in nature, but it requires you to be able to do it in the first place. And most people are just not able to do it in the first place. They don't know how to stabilize their hips and get into a good starting position. So you need to have a picture of what a good starting position is and then reverse engineer your technical approach around that, rather than looking at somebody's starting position, looking at them break down as they move from the floor and be like, your adductors are weak, let's do some Copenhagen planks. Because if that's the direction you end up going, like if you find yourself looking at a squat, a bench press, a deadlift, and then providing very simple exercises in order to fix it, you have to ask the question of scale more than anything, right? And ideally, you're lifting the most weight in the compound movements, in the squat, bench, deadlift. So if you're looking at somebody's, hips falling apart on a sumo deadlift and they're sumo deadlifting 300 kilos, how much help is a Copenhagen plank going to be? A Copenhagen plank probably isn't going to impact the 300 kilo deadlift. Now, that's not to say it won't impact the deadlift, because it might. And then organically, that might impact the 300 kilo deadlift. What I mean by that is if the Copenhagen plank impacts the ability to get into a good starting position with the first warm-up of 70 kilos, then the person makes a concerted effort to work on their technique with the 70 kilos, with the 120, with the 170, whatever it is as they're warming up, then you'll slowly see that bleed across into the top. But it's going to take a very long time if it's not a defined effort, a defined, mapped out, perfect sort of effort. And the problem is, on top of this, most people are told the wrong thing with warm-ups, to be as explosive as possible. Explosivity is not necessarily a terrible thing, but it is if you change your movement pattern. So if you're trying to fix that starting position, when you move as fast as you can, you revert to your strongest position, your strongest movement pattern. If there's something you're trying to fix within that, all you're doing is reinforcing it. You're just doing the same bad movement over and over again. So that's not going to make a great deal of sense. Same thing could be said, like if you are trying to fix somebody's knees on a squat and you get them doing like banded clamshells with a little pink band. Who's going to win in a fight between a 400 kilo squat and a little pink band around a clamshell? The 400 kilo squat is going to win every time. Besides the point, those two exercises don't add up. But you get what I'm trying to say. Positions matter first. Focus on positions and focus on emulating those positions as you go down the chain of accessories in order to try and fix this technique. This is really the big problem with thinking muscles versus positions, is that because I'm not trying to say that people who think like this are bad thinkers. They're not. I see a lot of absolutely fantastic logical pathways when it comes to technique and programming as well. Like even I completely disagree with the modern powerlifting meta around high frequency, 5 times a week benching, all of that sort of stuff. You already know that if you listen to this podcast. I disagree with it quite strongly for many reasons. But when I analyze and I look at how people are actually thinking about this, I think they have really good patterns of thinking. They're really thinking deeply. It's all adding up. When I watch, okay, you're doing this, because your understanding of this and this and this and this, I'm like, if I believed what they believe at the top, I'd probably follow a very similar pattern of thinking. I think it's great logic. It's a great logical waterfall, but it's attached to the wrong problem or the wrong base understanding of the problem. And muscle first thinking does this with technique. And like, again, I'm quad dominant in my squat. Therefore, if I want to strengthen my squat, I need to do more quad heavy exercises. I need to do more quad-based stuff. I need to do front squats. I need to do hack squats. I need to do more lunges, more leg extensions. I'm all for training the quads. Absolutely go and do that. But if you are quad dominant in your squat, you want to reverse that to what the opposite of that is. If you are quad dominant, you are hip weak. You are bracing weak. You are torso weak. So your problem is not a lack of strength in the quads, and that is not going to be the solution. The solution would be take the strength in the quads and apply it into a better movement pattern by strengthening the things, the bottlenecks, the weaknesses that you have, which are going to be hips, bracing, etc. The other problem that comes with muscles first thinking, this was a big thing, especially when like the scientific nerds really started taking over, like your pre-COVID 18, 19, maybe even through COVID, like that whole the whole era of free the scaps. If you're familiar with that, let your scaps just do whatever you want when you bench press. It doesn't make any logical sense when you think about it. It's like firing a cannon out of a canoe. You know, you don't want your shoulders to be flopping around when you're trying to bench. You want all of this to be rigid, locked in, so that the leverage of the pec can act upon the humerus and move the barbell upwards, right? You want the shoulders locked in. You don't want to free the scaps. But the problem was there was this heavy emphasis on what does the pec do? How does the pec work? All of this sort of stuff. And they were looking at it from the wrong angle. Yes, the pec does that. Yes, the pec needs to have the scap move. That's how your body moves. You know, when you reach forward, you do protract. When you pull back, you do retract. Freeing the scaps is not a bad thing to do in certain exercises for certain purposes, but in the bench press, when the goal is to maintain a particular position to move the most weight possible, doesn't make a great deal of sense. And so if you follow the logical pathway of muscles first, you start getting away from the principle that you need to understand in lifting, which is positions first. And you start doing all these crazy things that are to strengthen muscles that, as we said at the start, you don't even know what they're doing in the movement. So it doesn't make a great deal of sense. I'm not saying don't think about joint actions and angles and muscle actions on joints and then train that. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying don't reach to conclusions that don't actually make logical sense. And a lot of the times that's what you end up doing with this muscles first approach. Like, the other thing is that muscles first can override execution and understanding. So the classic example, to really make this obvious, and then we'll hone in on where you might be doing it without even realizing it. The classic example is the clamshell example I mentioned before. Maybe I'll do another podcast today on stability just to talk about this a bit more. But the classic example is, way back in the day, we were looking at people's knees cave in, and most people agreed back then, knees in, not a great thing for strength. Who cares about injury? Not a great thing for strength. Then you ask the question, okay, if the knees are caving in, what's that action? Internal rotation, adduction. What's the opposite of that action? What muscle controls that? Well, external rotation, abduction, glutes, glute mid. Cool. How do we train these things directly? How do we isolate them? Well, clamshell is like 100% glute mid. Let's do a bunch of clamshells. The problem is that's the muscle action. That's what the muscle does to the joint. We don't want that in the squat. We just don't want the opposite of that. We want it to functionally stabilize in that position. When you're squatting, you're not actively going into external rotation abduction while you're moving. You're sticking in a position and holding it. So you want to stabilize. You want an isometric of both things at the same time. So it doesn't make sense then to do a clamshell. It makes more sense to do a leg press and hold the right position of your knees. So the muscle is working to control that position, resisting falling in rather than actively pushing out. That's what makes more sense, right? It's resistance rather than activity in that case. That's pretty obvious when you lay it out like that. But people will still do things like, oh, your adductors are a secondary or tertiary or whatever extensor of the hip. Therefore, you need really strong adductors. Therefore, you should do a bunch of, Copenhagen planks or adductor machine, and that's going to fix your sumo squat. I agree. Do a bunch of Copenhagen planks. I agree. Do a bunch of adductor machine. I program these things actively because having strong adductors is a really important part of powerlifting. I don't agree that they immediately then impact technique. You impact technique and you impact positions by practicing those positions. And so if you take this muscles first approach, not only do you start applying it via the wrong exercises, then you get in the mindset of, I just need to strengthen this muscle. And then execution potentially goes out the window. So for example, what have we all done in powerlifting for a long time? Big back, big bench. Lats are really important. You need your lats in a bench, and you need your lats in a squat and a deadlift. Let's do a shitload of rows. I agree. Your back is important. I agree. Lats will help. They probably don't help as much as you think. Again, they're like a dynamic stabilizer of the spine rather than a prime mover in that sense. So training them to be really strong at prime moving heavy barbell rows, for example, is kind of a waste of time. Where they're really important with that exercise is creating the right position for like a low bar squat or the stabilizing position for a bench press with a specific scap position through a specific range of motion. And so what you've had for years is people doing exercises like, I am doing heavy rows and lat pull downs for my back, which is important for powerlifting, probably wasting a bunch of time. Not wasting a bunch of time and getting a big juicy back, which is sick, but maybe wasting a bunch of time in terms of what applicability it has to powerlifting. Positions first, muscles second. Muscles matter, but positions matter more if we're talking about powerlifting. That's it. Hope that helped. Keep watching and following and all that. Thank you very much.